The last ordinary thing Christine Jessop ever did was buy a piece of bubble gum. October 3rd, 1984. She was 9 years old. She had just stepped off her school bus, waved to a neighbor, walked home, left her school bag on the kitchen counter, and stopped at the corner store near her house. She took a nickel from the family's change dish. She bought the gum. She was out the door in under a minute. She was on her way to the park to meet her friend Leslie Chipman. She never arrived. Somewhere between that corner store and that park, on a quiet street in a community of 800 people where children played outside until the streetlights came on and nobody locked their doors, Christine Jessop crossed paths with someone she was not afraid of. Someone she recognized. Someone she had visited just 2 days before she disappeared. Someone who knew her name, knew her house, knew her father was gone, and had been waiting for exactly this window. She was carrying a recorder in her bag. She had written her name on it that morning in music class. She wanted to show it to her father. She never got the chance. For 36 years, the man responsible for Christine Jessop's death was not hiding. He was not living under a different name. He was not somewhere unreachable. He was right there, at the funeral, at the wake, walking through the fields with the search parties looking for a child he knew exactly where to find, standing in rooms full of people who loved her, performing the role of a grieving friend with enough conviction that nobody ever thought to look at him twice. And while he was doing all of that, while he was shaking hands, expressing condolences, and standing at that graveside, an innocent man was sitting inside a prison cell, serving a sentence for something Calvin Hoover had done. Now ask yourself this. What does it take for a person to attend the funeral of a child whose life they ended? To join a community search for someone they had already found? To look a grieving mother in the eye and say exactly the right things and keep saying them for decades? And how does a justice system convict the wrong person, imprison him for 18 months, drag him through a decade of legal proceedings, while the person actually responsible attends the birthday parties, the barbecues, the cemetery visits? This is the documented account of Christine Jessop, a 9-year-old girl from Queensville, Ontario, who went home from school on October 3rd, 1984, and never came back. A case that produced one of Canada's most significant wrongful convictions, consumed the careers of investigators across 3 police services, and took 36 years and a DNA science that did not exist in 1984 to finally put a confirmed name to the person responsible. If you are watching this channel for the first time, welcome to Unveiled Cold Case Files. We cover the cases that refused to stay cold, the victims who deserved more, the families who kept asking long after the rest of the world had stopped listening. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. Every week we cover cases at this depth. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. We want to know exactly how far Christine's story reaches. Stay with us, because what actually happened on that October afternoon in 1984, who Christine was, who took her, how an innocent man spent years in a prison cell for it, and how science finally reached back across 36 years to expose the truth, is something you will not find covered anywhere with this level of confirmed detail. Queensville, Ontario in 1984 was the kind of place that existed everywhere in rural Canada and nowhere in particular. A small cluster of homes around a general store, a church, a cemetery, and a playground. A population of about 800 people, most of whom knew each other's names, each other's children, and each other's routines. About 60 kilometers north of Toronto, far enough from the city to feel like a genuinely different world. Children in Queensville played outside until the streetlights came on. Nobody thought twice about it. Doors stayed unlocked. The community watched out for itself not through policy or procedure, but through the accumulated knowledge of people who had lived alongside each other for years. Everyone was a familiar face. Everything was, for the most part, safe. Christine Marion Jessop was born on November 29, 1974. At 9 years old, she was exactly the kind of child that Queensville was built for. She was a tomboy. She rode her bike down the quiet streets until she had memorized every turn. She played baseball. She climbed things. She ran from place to place with the kind of energy that leaves adults watching and exhaling. She was, in her mother Janet's own words, a girl who would not hurt a fly. Her brother Kenny, 3 years older, was her constant companion, even on the days he would rather have been left alone. She followed him everywhere. That was just how it was between them. At Queensville Public School, where Christine was in grade 4 in October 1984, her teachers remembered her as outgoing, wide smile, the kind of presence that made a classroom feel more occupied. She loved animals. She had a beagle named Freckles that she gave more attention than most children give anything. She wanted to become a veterinarian, a plan she talked about with the certainty of someone who had already decided. Gentle, caring. Already thinking about what she could do for the world, rather than what the world could do for her. Her closest friend was a girl named Leslie Chipman, who she saw regularly after school. She had plans to meet Leslie at a nearby park on the afternoon of October 3, 1984. The Jessop family had come to Queensville from Toronto. Christine's father, Bob Jessop, worked at a company called Eastern Independent Telecom as the lead hand of cable installers. Her mother Janet raised the children, kept the household, and was the kind of neighbor people described as genuinely warm and present. Kenny and Christine had joined baseball teams, made friends quickly, and settled into small-town life without difficulty. By the autumn of 1984, however, things inside the Jessop household were more complicated than the surface suggested. Bob Jessop had been convicted of misappropriation of funds, specifically, stealing significant sums of money from his own special needs uncle. On September 16, 1984, just over 2 weeks before Christine disappeared, he began an 18-month sentence at the Toronto East Detention Centre. Janet told people in the community that he was away on business. Those closest to her understood the real situation. Christine missed her father. That detail matters for what comes next. Wednesday, October 3, 1984 began as an ordinary school morning for Christine Jessop. At around 7 in the morning, Janet was on the phone with a family friend. Christine could be heard in the background, upset, visibly distressed. The reason is not confirmed in any official record. What is confirmed is that Christine missed her father deeply, and Bob had been gone from that home since September 16. 17 days into an 18-month sentence at the Toronto East Detention Centre. Janet had arranged that afternoon to travel into Toronto with Kenny to visit Bob at the detention facility. Christine wanted to go. Janet decided she was too young for that environment. Christine went to school instead. But before she left the house that day, something happened that would shape the afternoon in ways nobody in that household could have foreseen. At Queensville Public School that day, Christine received something that made her happy. In music class, her teacher distributed recorders to the students, small plastic woodwind instruments. Christine was pleased with hers and had a plan for it. She wanted to bring it home to show to someone she loved. When investigators later found Christine's remains near Sunderland, the recorder was there beside her. Her name was still written on it. Christine stepped off the school bus at approximately 3:50 in the afternoon on Leslie Street, waving to her neighbor Dorothy Ellis as she walked toward the house. She went inside, left her school bag on the kitchen counter, collected the day's mail, and was back outside within minutes. At some point between 4 and 4:30 in the afternoon, the owner of the corner store near her home, a man named Harold Grayson, saw Christine come in alone. She took a nickel from the family's change dish and bought a piece of bubble gum. She left about a minute later. She was heading to the park to meet her friend Leslie Chipman. She never arrived. Janet and Kenny returned home at approximately 4:10 in the afternoon. They had stopped at a dentist appointment in Newmarket and at a Sears store to pick up a watch for Kenny. They came through the door to a house that was quiet in a way that registered before any specific detail confirmed it. Christine was not there. Her bicycle was where she kept it but had fallen over with some minor damage. Her school bag sat on the counter. The mail was beside it. Her coat was on a hook, placed on a peg higher than a 9-year-old could reasonably have reached on her own. Janet called Christine's friends. She walked the routes Christine would have taken. She checked the park where Leslie Chipman had been waiting alone. No one had seen Christine since the corner store. As the evening came on without any answer, Janet called the York Regional Police. Officers arrived between 7 and 8 that evening and filed a missing persons report. They noted the scene, the school bag, the mail, the coat on the high hook. A command post was established at the nearby fire hall. Word moved through Queensville the way it always did in a community of 800 people, fast and completely. Neighbors showed up with flashlights without being asked. The search began that same night. Bob Jessop was notified at the detention center. Authorities granted him a compassionate release. He came home to a house where his daughter was missing and a community moving through dark fields calling her name. The York Regional Police were a small force, one officer for every 860 residents. They had no major crimes division and no prior experience handling a case of this nature. The gaps in their preparation showed from the very first hours. The first officer on scene picked Christine's coat off the hook to examine it, moving what may have been the earliest available piece of physical evidence. The community searched for days. Volunteers covered fields, woods, and cider roads. A woman named Marg Johnson told the Toronto Star that people were full of anxiety and genuine disbelief. Something like this was not supposed to happen in Queensville. Days became weeks. As families across Ontario prepared for Christmas, the Jessop home had no tree that year and only a handful of gifts for Kenny. Bob and Janet issued public appeals for information. Christine's photograph appeared on television screens and in newspapers across the country. Hundreds of community members assisted in the search. Tens of thousands of tips came in. None produced anything. On December 31, 1984, New Year's Eve, a man named Fred Patterson was walking near Lake Scugog with his 2 daughters in the rural countryside near Sunderland, Ontario, 56 kilometers east of Queensville. They came across what appeared to be human remains at the edge of a farmer's field and called police. When officers arrived at that field in Sunderland, they found clothing matching what Christine had been wearing on October 3. They found her recorder. Her name was still on it. The medical examination that followed confirmed Christine Jessop had not survived. The cause of death was determined to be multiple wounds consistent with a sharp instrument. She was 9 years old. She had been carrying that recorder to show someone she loved. Reverend Bev Hall of St. Mary's Anglican Church delivered the news to the Jessop family. On January 7, 1985, Christine was laid to rest. Nearly the entire community of Queensville came. People who had searched the fields in October, who had distributed her photograph, who had called her name into the autumn cold, they all stood in that January cold and said goodbye. The investigation into who was responsible was now fully underway. The evidence was limited. The leads were few. And the investigation was about to turn in a direction that would compound the tragedy of Christine Jessop's death with a decade of injustice against an innocent man. Christine Jessop left home that afternoon with a recorder in her bag and plans to meet her friend at the park. She had been home alone for less than an hour when she disappeared. Someone knew that window existed. Someone had been waiting for it. Now the police received Christine's missing persons report between 7 and 8 that evening. The evidence at the scene, the coat on the high hook, the recorder missing, the bicycle fallen which told a story that pointed toward someone Christine had trusted enough to go with willingly. What do you think should have been the very first line of inquiry that evening? Tell us in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe to Unveiled Cold Case Files right now. Hit the notification bell, because this case is taking a turn that should never have happened as a neighbor's quiet life becomes the foundation of a prosecution. An innocent man arrested on his way to band practice. And the investigation fixes so completely on the wrong person that it would take a decade and a DNA test to break free of it. Guy Paul Morin was not a suspect in October 1984. He was not a suspect in November. He was not a suspect in December when Christine's remains were found in that field near Sunderland. He became a suspect on February 14, 1985, Valentine's Day, because of a single sentence spoken by a grieving mother who was pressed by investigators for names. Janet Jessop described her next-door neighbor to police as a weird-type guy who played the clarinet. That sentence redirected an entire investigation. It would cost an innocent man 10 years of his life. To understand how that happened, and why it persisted as long as it did, you need to understand who Guy Paul Morin actually was before any of this started. Morin was 25 years old when he was arrested in April 1985. He lived next door to the Jessop family with his parents, Alphonse and Ida. The family had been in that home since 1978. Alphonse was a retired engineer who had taught at Seneca College. Ida was a retired teacher who still did occasional supply work. Guy Paul had 4 sisters and was the only son. He was a quiet man with specific interests. He kept bees in the backyard and grew flowers around the hives specifically to encourage the colonies. He played the saxophone and clarinet in 3 community bands and had a deep appreciation for 1940s swing music, a preference that put him out of step with everything around him in 1984. He was talented enough to have won competitions. His sister Denise described him as gifted across multiple instruments. He did not drink or smoke. He had no criminal record beyond minor parking matters. To the people of Queensville, he was a bit unusual. In the absence of any other credible lead, unusual became something more dangerous than that. On October 3, 1984, the day Christine disappeared, Guy Paul's time card confirmed he left his job at Interiors International Limited at 3:32 in the afternoon. He stopped in Newmarket to buy groceries on the way home and arrived at his parents' house between 5 and 5:30 in the evening. His brother-in-law was leaving as he came through the door. They spoke briefly. He put the groceries away, took a nap, woke at 6:30, had dinner with his parents, and spent the evening helping his father with renovation work outside under makeshift floodlights. Every element of that account was verifiable and verified. That same evening, a York Regional Police officer visited the Morin home to ask whether she had noticed anything unusual. During that visit, the officer recorded in his notebook that Guy Paul stared straight ahead and showed no apparent interest in what was being discussed. That observation was logged. It would later be presented in court as evidence of a guilty conscience. He stared straight ahead. That was what the officer wrote. That became part of the case against him. In the weeks after Christine was found, the community of Queensville had already formed its view of Guy Paul Morin. People noted that he had not joined the search during the 90 days Christine was missing. His documented whereabouts confirmed he was home that first evening. They noted that he had not attended Christine's funeral on January 7. Guy Paul Morin later testified under oath that he had never been to a funeral before in his life. He believed attendance required a formal invitation. He stayed home. The community interpreted his absence as something far darker. By February 1985, the FBI had provided York Regional Police with a behavioral profile of the likely person responsible, an intelligent white male, a Queensville resident, aged between 19 and 26. Guy Paul Morin was 25 and lived next door to the Jessops. When Janet described him as a weird-type guy who played the clarinet, investigators placed him at the center of their investigation. On February 19, surveillance was established on the Morin family home. On February 22, 2 officers formally interviewed Guy Paul for the first time. He maintained his complete innocence throughout. He answered every question. He gave investigators nothing that could honestly be interpreted as an admission. On April 22, 1985, investigators raided the Morin home and arrested Guy Paul as he was driving to a community band practice. He was handcuffed, charged with first-degree killing. He voluntarily provided blood, hair, and saliva samples. He was denied bail and spent the next 10 months in Whitby jail awaiting trial. The first trial began on January 7, 1986, in London, Ontario, moved from Toronto due to concerns about impartiality anywhere near Queensville. Crown prosecutors John Scott and Susan MacLean built their case on 3 foundations. The first was forensic hair and fiber evidence. Experts from the Ontario Centre of Forensic Sciences testified that a hair found near Christine's body was consistent with Morin's, and that microscopic fibers from his car were consistent with Christine's clothing. The findings were presented as significant. What was not disclosed at the time and was later confirmed, was that those samples had been contaminated inside the laboratory. The scientists knew this. They told nobody. The second pillar was the testimony of two men who had shared custody with Morin before trial. A man named Robert May and another identified only as Mr. X both claimed to have heard Morin confess to Christine's death while held with him at the Quint Detention Center in 1985. Both were facing serious charges of their own at the time they came forward. Both received favorable treatment from the Crown in exchange for their cooperation. Defense counsel Clayton Ruby established this in cross-examination. The Crown had given these men a direct personal incentive to fabricate. The third element was an undercover officer who had spent 4 days inside Morin's cell attempting to produce a confession. The officer had nothing useful to report. Morin had said nothing incriminating to anyone at any point in any setting. Clayton Ruby's defense rested on the documented alibi. Morin's time card, the grocery stop, his confirmed arrival time, none of it allowed for what he was accused of. Ruby also introduced a legal alternative argument. If the jury concluded Morin had committed the act, his prior psychiatric evaluations might support a defense of not criminally responsible. That argument was a procedural protection. The jury treated it as something else. After less than a day of deliberation, the jury acquitted Guy Paul Morin on February 7, 1986. The verdict was met with fury. The Jessop family condemned it. The police condemned it. The media treated an acquittal as a failure of the process rather than a finding of fact. An entire community had already decided who was responsible. The Crown appealed within weeks. The grounds: the trial judge had made a fundamental error in directing the jury on the standard of reasonable doubt. The Ontario Court of Appeal agreed and ordered a new trial on June 5, 1987. Morin appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court dismissed his appeal on November 17, 1988. An innocent man, already acquitted, was going back to trial. The second trial began on May 28, 1990, in Windsor, Ontario, preceded by 10 months of legal motions by Morin's new defense lawyer, Jack Pinkowski, who fought for the disclosure of police reports never provided to Clayton Ruby before the first trial. When those reports were finally produced, they contained information that should have altered the original investigation. Some documented alternative lines of inquiry that had never been pursued. Others raised questions about the integrity of the physical evidence. The second trial ran for 9 months, the longest proceeding of its kind in Canadian history at that time. 120 witnesses testified. The Crown returned to the same hair and fiber evidence. Robert May and Mr. X returned to deliver essentially the same informant testimony they had provided in 1986. The defense challenged every element. On July 30, 1992, the jury convicted Guy Paul Morin of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, transferred to Kingston Penitentiary, placed in the general population, and continued to state his innocence in that prison exactly as he had done in every interrogation, courtroom, and interview since April 1985. By February 1993, public doubt had grown enough that Morin was granted bail pending appeal. Kirk Macken's 1992 book, Redrum the Innocent, had detailed the failures of the Crown's case for a national readership. The CBC Fifth Estate had produced a documentary called Odd Man Out, featuring the first television interview with Morin conducted from inside Kingston Penitentiary. Even Bob Jessop had publicly stated the handling of the case felt, in his words, like a script for the Keystone Cops. Robert May, the primary informant witness, began telling people in 1993 that he had fabricated the confession entirely. He recanted multiple times and later admitted under oath that he had invented the confession to gain favor with the Crown. A superior court judge would eventually declare May a dangerous offender, describing him in open court as a psychopath with little prospect of rehabilitation. The testimony he had delivered, which had contributed to sending an innocent man to prison, was a complete fabrication. None of that recantation arrived in time to stop the 1992 verdict. On January 23, 1995, just days before Morin's scheduled appeal was to be heard, new DNA testing on biological evidence preserved from Christine's clothing produced a result that ended the legal proceedings instantly. Every previous attempt to work with that material had failed. This attempt produced a clear and unambiguous result. The genetic profile did not match Guy Paul Morin. It could not belong to him. The Crown's own prosecutor stood before the Ontario Court of Appeal and stated on the record that the evidence proved, as an indisputable scientific fact, that Morin was not the person responsible and should be acquitted. Chief Justice Charles Dubin entered a directed verdict of acquittal on January 23, 1995. 10 years after his arrest, 18 months served in prison, a decade under the weight of a charge that had taken his reputation, his freedom, and years of his life, Guy Paul Morin walked out of the legal proceedings a formally exonerated man. Ontario Attorney General Charles Harnick issued a public apology. Ken Jessop issued a personal apology. The Ontario government awarded Guy Paul Morin and his parents $1.25 million in compensation. Morin went on to marry, raise 2 sons, work at Toronto's Pearson International Airport, and record a CD of his clarinet music, the very instrument that had been used to paint him as a suspect in 1985. He rebuilt his life with the same quiet determination that had defined everything about him from the beginning. The DNA that cleared Morin in 1995 confirmed that someone else was responsible for Christine Jessop's death. But the science of that era could only tell investigators that the genetic profile was not Morin's. It could not yet tell them whose it was. That answer would take another 25 years. And the person responsible had been watching the entire Morin prosecution play out on the news alongside everyone else in Canada. His name had appeared in the original case files. Nobody had ever followed it. When Guy Paul Morin walked out of the Ontario Court of Appeal on January 23, 1995, as an exonerated man, a question followed him through that door. The same question every person in Canada was asking. How did this happen? Not just how did one jury convict him in 1992. How did the entire apparatus, the police, the forensic scientists, the Crown prosecutors, the courts, sustain a prosecution against an innocent man across 2 trials, nearly a decade, and 18 months of actual imprisonment? How does a justice system look at a verified alibi, compromised forensic samples, and the testimony of men later exposed as fabricators, and still produce a conviction? The Ontario government needed those answers on the public record. On June 26, 1996, the Lieutenant Governor in Council appointed the Honourable Fred Kaufman, QC, a former judge of the Quebec Court of Appeal, to lead a full public inquiry into everything that had been done to Guy Paul Morin. Kaufman arrived in England, eventually reached Canada, built a distinguished legal career, rose to one of the most senior judicial appointments in the country, and in 1996 was asked to determine how the administration of Canadian justice had failed a furniture worker from Queensville, Ontario. In his memoir, Kaufman later described the Morin inquiry as the most significant undertaking of his entire career. The hearings began on February 10, 1997, and ran for 146 days. 120 witnesses testified, investigators, forensic analysts, Crown prosecutors, defense counsel, informant witnesses, and criminal justice experts from around the world. 25 parties received standing to participate. Over 100,000 pages of trial evidence, exhibits, and documentation were examined. Nothing about the investigation, the forensic process, the 2 prosecutions, or the appeals was left outside the inquiry's scope. On April 9, 1998, Justice Kaufman released his report. 2 volumes, 1,380 pages, 119 recommendations. Lawyer Bruce MacFarlane later described it as arguably the most thorough judicial review ever conducted into the causes of wrongful conviction and how to prevent them. That assessment has not been seriously challenged. What Kaufman found, stated plainly, was this: No Crown Counsel and no police officer had set out to convict an innocent man. What they had done instead was develop what Kaufman described as tunnel vision of the most staggering proportions. He defined it precisely in the report. Tunnel vision, he wrote, is a single-minded and overly narrow focus on a particular investigative or prosecutorial theory, so as to unreasonably color the evaluation of information received and one's conduct in response to that information. In the Morin case, that theory was fixed early and held tightly. Guy Paul Morin was responsible for Christine Jessop's death. Once it took root, everything the investigation produced was filtered through it. Evidence that supported the theory was pursued. Evidence that contradicted it was set aside. Alternative lines of inquiry remained unexplored. The tunnel was entered, and the investigation never found its way back out. The report identified 5 primary failures. The first was the investigative tunnel vision itself. Durham Regional Police had fixed on Morin so completely that, according to the report, some of those involved continued to believe in his guilt even after the DNA evidence confirming his innocence was placed directly in front of them. The commitment to the theory was that total. Witnesses whose early accounts had been inconsistent with guilt were re-interviewed in ways that caused their recollections to shift toward the predetermined conclusion. Kaufman observed that it was notable how the memories of several Crown witnesses improved as the proceedings advanced, and that some of this improvement was the product of an interview process that had not been designed to create unreliable evidence, but had nonetheless done exactly that. The second failure was the forensic evidence from the Ontario Centre of Forensic Sciences. The hair and fiber analysis that formed the physical foundation of the case against Morin was, in Kaufman's assessment, essentially without value. Microscopic hair comparison, examining samples under a microscope to identify shared characteristics, cannot confirm that a particular hair belongs to a specific individual. It can exclude people as sources. It cannot confirm them. The experts who testified in both trials presented their findings in a way that suggested far greater certainty than the methodology could support, and the samples had been contaminated inside the laboratory. The scientists knew about the contamination. They did not disclose it to the police, the prosecutors, or the court. Evidence presented to 2 separate juries as physical proof linking Morin to Christine was contaminated material whose handlers knew could not be reliably interpreted. The third failure was the informant witness testimony. Robert May and Mr. X had both claimed to have heard Morin confess while held with him at the Quint Detention Center. Both were facing serious charges of their own. Both had received favorable treatment from the Crown in exchange for their cooperation. The Kaufman report found that testimony from individuals with direct personal incentives to fabricate had been treated with far too little scrutiny by the prosecutors who relied on it and the courts that admitted it. Kaufman made 33 specific recommendations on the future use of informant witnesses, including mandatory disclosure of any benefits received, stricter reliability guidelines, and the creation of a national informer registry. He stopped short of an outright ban on such testimony, but described the dangers of its use in the Morin case in terms that left no ambiguity about his view. The fourth failure involved how civilian witnesses had been handled. Police had disclosed to certain witnesses what forensic evidence they believed existed before those witnesses were formally interviewed for the record. When you tell a witness what you have already found and what you believe happened before asking them what they remember, you do not receive a memory. You receive a reflection of your own conclusions fed back to you in a different voice. That is what Kaufman described as an interview process that was not designed to create unreliable evidence, but did so regardless. The fifth failure was the relationship between the Crown and the investigating police. Prosecutors had been too closely aligned with the officers building the case. That alignment at times prevented them from seeing the serious reliability problems with their own witnesses and the evidence being presented. The adversarial system requires the Crown to approach evidence independently. In the Morin case, that independence had not been maintained. The 119 recommendations that followed addressed every identified failure. Mandatory audio and video recording of all suspect interviews, stricter protocols for collecting, handling, and disclosing forensic evidence. Wide-ranging reforms to the use of informant witnesses. Mandatory training for police and prosecutors on recognizing confirmation bias. The tendency to interpret new information as supporting what one already believes. Strengthened disclosure requirements from Crown to defense. And Recommendation 32 specifically, the creation of a national DNA databank. That databank was established in 2001. It operates today as a direct outcome of what was done to Guy Paul Morin. The Kaufman Commission produced something beyond its specific recommendations. It gave Canadian law enforcement and the courts a common vocabulary for discussing wrongful convictions that had not previously existed in formal institutional language. Tunnel vision, confirmation bias, witness contamination. These concepts entered the professional training of Canadian investigators and prosecutors in ways that had concrete and documented effects on how cases were subsequently handled. The Morin inquiry was cited in wrongful conviction cases that followed as foundational. It shaped the inquiries into the cases of David Milgaard, Thomas Sofino, and others who came after. The case also produced something that outlasted the inquiry itself. The advocates who had gathered around Guy Paul Morin's cause, who had believed from early on that the system had made a catastrophic error and had pushed persistently for that acknowledgement, formally organized themselves after the exoneration as the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted. That organization is today known as Innocence Canada. It has secured the exoneration of more than 20 wrongfully convicted Canadians since its founding. It exists because of what happened to a beekeeper from Queensville who played the clarinet in 3 bands. When the Kaufman report was released, Guy Paul Morin commented with the same measured calm he had brought to every public statement across 10 years of legal proceedings. He acknowledged that Kaufman had concluded no one intended to convict an innocent man. Then he said, "The intent may not have been there, but the blunders sure were." He was right on both counts. The investigation into Christine Jessop's death did not close when Morin was exonerated. Toronto police took over from Durham Regional Police in February 1995. A dedicated task force investigated and formally eliminated more than 300 individuals over the following 3 years. In March 1998, the same month the Kaufman Commission published its final summations, that task force disbanded. No further leads were immediately available. The files stayed open. The person responsible was still out there, and the answers that would eventually come were still more than 2 decades away. The Kaufman Commission is considered by legal scholars to be the most thorough public examination of the causes of wrongful conviction ever conducted. 146 hearing days, 100,000 pages of documents, and at the center of all of it, a case that began because an officer wrote in a notebook that a man stared straight ahead during a conversation. The commission identified tunnel vision as the root failure in this case. After 1998, with all the reforms the inquiry produced, do you believe that tunnel vision in criminal investigations has actually been reduced in Canada? Or do you think the same failure could still be happening in cases we simply have not heard about yet? Tell us in the comments. And before we go on, kindly subscribe to Unveiled Cold Case Files right now and hit the notification bell, because next is where science finally reaches the killer. The DNA process that stretched back 36 years. The detective who walked out of a training course and came home with exactly the tool this case had been waiting for. And the October 2020 announcement that gave the Jessop family the name they had needed for 36 years. The biological evidence that would eventually identify Calvin Hoover had been in storage since the end of 1984, preserved from Christine Jessop's clothing during the examination that followed the discovery of her remains in that field near Sunderland on New Year's Eve. That evidence had survived everything this case had gone through across 36 years. 2 trials, an exoneration, a public inquiry, a task force that investigated 300 people and found nothing, years of silence. It had survived all of it, and it was waiting. The difficulty was not a lack of effort to use it. Investigators had tried. The genetic material in that evidence was so degraded, broken down by time, storage conditions, and the biological processes that work steadily against preservation across decades, that every previous extraction attempt had failed to produce anything workable. The science available in 1984 could not touch it. The science available in 1995, when Morin was cleared, could establish only that the profile was not his. It could not identify who it belonged to. The science available when the task force disbanded in 1998 had reached the limit of what the tools of that era could accomplish. Then the tools changed. Detective Sergeant Steve Smith of the Toronto Police Service's Cold Case Unit had followed the Christine Jessop case since he was a child. It was that kind of case, one that had entered Toronto's public consciousness and never left it. When he joined the Cold Case Unit, the Jessop file was part of the landscape. He understood its full history. In 2019, Detective Smith attended a 2-week training course on a new investigative approach that had come to public attention the previous year through the arrest of the Golden State Killer in California. The method was called forensic genetic genealogy. Smith completed that training and understood immediately that what he had learned had direct application to a file he already knew deeply. He came home and applied it to Christine Jessop's case. The starting point was the degraded biological evidence from 1984. Smith arranged for it to be sent to Othram Inc., a private laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, built specifically to extract workable DNA profiles from biological material that conventional methods could not process. Othram specialized in precisely this kind of difficult degraded evidence. The Jessop sample was a case they had been designed for. Othram's technology produced a genetic profile. Once that profile existed, Othram uploaded it to 2 genealogical databases, GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. These were the only major consumer genealogy platforms that explicitly permitted law enforcement to access their users' genetic information for investigative purposes. Most other platforms required warrants. GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA had disclosed the possibility of law enforcement access to their users directly in their terms of service. One significant limitation existed at the time of the Jessop search. Only 14% of GEDmatch users had chosen to make their profiles available for law enforcement matching. That constrained the accessible pool considerably. But within that pool, genetic matches existed, distant relatives of the person whose DNA had been preserved with Christine's clothing. What forensic genetic genealogy does with those matches is not a simple comparison. A match with a distant relative does not identify a suspect. It provides a starting point for genealogical research, the same kind of historical family investigation that amateur genealogists conduct on platforms like Ancestry.com, except conducted in every direction through family trees, with the goal of identifying a specific living or recently deceased individual. The work is painstaking, methodical, and requires expertise in both genetic science and historical records. Toronto police brought in Anthony Lucas Redgrave and Lee Bingham Redgrave to conduct that research. The Redgraves operated Redgrave Research Forensic Services from Athol, Massachusetts. Anthony held a master's degree in instructional design and technology and had developed deep expertise in forensic genealogy through years of voluntary casework with the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit dedicated to identifying unidentified deceased persons through genealogical methods. He and Lee had worked on more than 24 cold cases through that organization before the Jessop file reached them. Over 6 months, the Redgrave team built a family tree outward from the genetic matches Othram's profile had produced. The work moved through generations, following shared DNA markers that pointed to common ancestry, tracing lineage through historical documents, cross-referencing names against available archives. They were building backward through time before they could move forward. That process eventually led to a specific line of Canadian family history. A United Empire Loyalist family traced all the way back to a man named Henry Hoover Jr., born in 1804 in Lennox County, Ontario. From there, the tree had to be reconstructed forward through every subsequent generation to identify which of his descendants had been present and in the right location in October 1984. Detective Smith worked alongside this research, drawing on resources the Redgraves could not access directly. He used his Toronto Public Library card to access historical records and archives. He worked through the Toronto Star's archived material. He used the Toronto Police Service's electronic case management system, a platform called Power Case, to search the accumulated documentation from 36 years of investigation. The Jessop files had filled 4 skids worth of physical material gathered across 3 police services. Power Case allowed Smith to search all of it electronically in ways that had simply not been possible when those records existed only in physical form. When Smith entered the addresses associated with a name that had emerged from Redgrave's genealogical work, the search returned a result. A former Scarborough address, a townhouse near the Toronto Zoo, appeared in one of the original investigation notebooks. The name attached to that address was listed in the case files as a Jessop family friend and close contact at the time of Christine's disappearance. Notes from his wife's interview the day after Christine went missing indicated he had probably been aware that Christine would be home alone on October 3. The name was Calvin Hoover. It was a name Detective Smith had never previously encountered in connection with this case. It had not appeared in the thousands of tips received since 1984. It had not surfaced during the investigation of the 300 suspects the post-exoneration task force had cleared. It had been in a notebook, listed as a family friend, for 36 years, and nobody had ever followed it to a conclusion. Smith and Redgrave's team had narrowed a field of 33,000 possible candidates down to a single individual. The genetic tree and the historical records pointed to Calvin Hoover of Toronto, 28 years old in October 1984, known to the Jessop family, with documented access to the family home. And he was dead, having died in Port Hope, Ontario in 2015. What followed was the confirmation step. Genetic genealogy produces a candidate. That candidate requires direct verification through traditional forensic means before it can carry investigative weight. When Calvin Hoover died in 2015, an autopsy was conducted as standard procedure, and a blood sample was preserved at the Centre of Forensic Sciences Laboratory in Toronto. Detective Smith obtained the necessary judicial authorization, one of the first warrants of its kind in Canada, to compel the use of a deceased person's preserved biological material in a criminal investigation, and requested a direct comparison between Hoover's autopsy sample and the profile extracted from Christine's clothing. The Center of Forensic Sciences conducted the comparison. The 2 profiles matched. On October 9, 2020, 36 years and 6 days after Christine Jessop walked away from the corner store with a piece of bubble gum and never reached the park to meet her friend Leslie Chipman, Toronto police confirmed the identification. The DNA evidence from Christine's clothing belonged to Calvin Hoover. Anthony and Lee Redgrave learned the confirmation had come through from a text message Detective Smith sent them a few minutes before the scheduled press conference. The message told them to turn on the television. They had not known until that moment that the comparison had returned a match. 6 months of work. The genealogical tree traced backward through generations to a United Empire Loyalist family in 1804, then forward through every branch until a single name remained, had been confirmed. And if Unveiled Cold Case Files is giving you coverage of this case that you have not found anywhere else, subscribe right now. Hit the notification bell as we finally turn to the man who was actually responsible for Christine Jessop's death. The man who knew her, who had access to her, who joined the search parties, attended the funeral, and spent 36 years in plain sight while another man's life was taken apart. He was not the person anyone in Queensville was talking about. He was not a neighbor who had behaved oddly. He was not someone who had been described as a weird-type guy. He had not failed to attend the funeral. He had not failed to join the search. He had done the opposite of all of it. He had joined the search. He had attended the funeral. He had been at the wake at the Jessop family home that evening. He had stood among police officers who were there specifically to watch faces. He had extended his condolences to the family whose 9-year-old daughter he had taken from the world. And then he had gone home. Calvin Hoover was born on April 7, 1956 in Ontario. In 1984, he was 28 years old, living in a townhouse in North Scarborough, the east end of Toronto, with his wife Heather and their children. He had dark hair, prominent front teeth, and a thin face made thinner by large-framed glasses. People who encountered him socially described him as outgoing, the kind of person who could hold a room in conversation and make those around him feel at ease. He had a charisma that functioned well at a surface level. But the people who lived inside his life, his family, his partners, the people who depended on him, experienced a different version of the man entirely. Calvin and Heather had met in 1977 when she was 20 years old. She had 2 sons from a previous relationship whom Calvin later adopted. They had 2 more sons together, 4 boys in total. By 1984, both were working at Eastern Independent Telecom, a communications company in Markham that wired businesses across the area. Calvin worked as a cable installer. Heather was a dispatcher. And Bob Jessop, Christine's father, was the lead hand of the cable installation team that Calvin worked under. The professional connection grew into a social one. The Hoovers and the Jessops started spending time together outside of work. Birthdays, barbecues. Janet and Heather became particularly close. Janet called Heather the goofy newfie. Heather sometimes babysat Christine, who called her Auntie Heather. Though the 2 families lived more than 50 kilometers apart, Janet and Heather met regularly to share a pot of tea and let the children play. Christine had been to the Hoover home multiple times. She knew this family. She trusted them. Heather's older boys played with her. The youngest Hoover child, a toddler in 1984, was someone Christine had a particular fondness for. On the evening of October 1, 1984, 2 days before Christine disappeared, Janet drove Christine and Kenny to the Hoover home in Scarborough. Bob was in custody. Janet needed the company of a close friend. During that visit, Janet mentioned that she would be going to visit Bob in jail in 2 days and that Christine was too young to come along. Calvin may have heard that directly. Heather may have passed it along to him afterward without any awareness of what she was sharing. Either way, by the morning of October 3, Calvin Hoover knew that Christine Jessop would be home alone that afternoon. He went to work as normal. His job gave him flexibility, moving between installation sites, working independently, coming and going without close supervision. He used that flexibility that afternoon. When Janet called Heather before leaving for Toronto on the morning of October 3, the routine call to pass along any work messages for Bob, investigators believe it confirmed the window Calvin needed. The call went through. The afternoon window was confirmed. Janet told only 3 people Christine might be alone: Bob's lawyer, Bob's employer, and Heather Hoover. Investigators believe Calvin encountered Christine near her home sometime after she stepped off the school bus at 3:50 in the afternoon. The most credible explanation for what happened next is one that requires no force and no alarm. He was a family friend. He was trusted. He was someone Christine had visited just 2 days earlier. If he told her he was taking her to see her father, she would not have hesitated for a moment. She had been crying about missing Bob since 7 that morning. Her coat ended up on a peg too high for her to have placed it herself. She took the recorder she had received in music class that day, the one she wanted to show to her father. By approximately 4:10 in the afternoon, she was gone. Calvin Hoover knew the Sunderland area. He had a longtime school friend who lived there. They had visited regularly for outdoor activities, going into the bush together. The Hoover family also had a cabin in the area near where Christine's remains were later found. Investigators believe he took Christine there. They believe that is where she died. They believe he moved her remains afterward to the field in Sunderland, where Fred Patterson and his daughters found them on New Year's Eve. Her recorder was there when the remains were discovered. Her name was still on it. What Calvin Hoover did in the hours and days that followed tells you as much about him as anything else in his documented history. He did not stay home. He did not put distance between himself and the Jessop family. He did the opposite. He joined the organized community search for Christine. He walked the same fields as the neighbors and volunteers who were genuinely trying to find her. He attended the funeral on January 7, 1985. He went to the wake at the Jessop home afterward. Police officers were at that funeral watching faces, photographing the crowd, looking for anything out of place. Calvin Hoover stood among them, offered his condolences, and left. He was never approached, never photographed as a person of interest, never asked to account for his whereabouts on October 3. The day after Christine disappeared, Sergeant Raymond Bunce of York Regional Police interviewed Heather Hoover at the Jessop home. Heather had gone straight to Queensville when she heard the news. She answered every question Bunce put to her. She told him she had been at work on October 3 and assumed Calvin had been working too. She eventually said she needed to get home to her husband and children. Bunce thanked her and left. Calvin Hoover, who had taken Christine from that house approximately 24 hours before that conversation, was never spoken to. His name was recorded in the case files more than once, listed as a family friend and as Heather's husband. Nobody followed it up. Heather said later, when she came to understand what had been sitting in front of investigators for decades, "Little did we know, he was right under our thumbs." In the years that followed, Calvin stood at Christine's grave with Heather when she went to pay her respects. He consoled his wife as she mourned the child he had killed. That continued for years. Their marriage was increasingly difficult. He was prone to unexplained absences, moodiness, and a pattern of behavior Heather later described as making the household hard to live in. He was, she told investigators, never the father he should have been. The last 2 or 3 years of their marriage, she said, were particularly hard for her and the children. They separated in late 1993. When the DNA cleared Guy Paul Morin in January 1995, Calvin Hoover's response was not relief that justice had been corrected. It was fear that his own exposure had moved a step closer. He had been careless. He knew what he had left behind at the scene. The genetic profile now in investigators' hands, the one that was not Morin's, was his. He had no way to know how long it would take for science to connect that profile to a name. He had been a regular presence at local pubs. After the exoneration, he was there more often. By 1996, he had moved to a low-rent housing complex in Ajax, Ontario. That December, he was convicted of impaired driving, fined $800, license suspended for a year. The only criminal conviction in his name the courts had a record of. He remarried in 2004, a woman from Welland, Ontario. They lived in Waterdown. His second wife, Joanne, died in 2009. He moved again, eventually settling in Port Hope, Ontario. After the identification in 2020, Toronto Police Detective Sergeant Steve Smith described the portrait that emerged from conversations with almost 100 people who had known Calvin across his life. He appeared functional and even pleasant in social settings. He was difficult, unpredictable, and at times destructive in the relationships that required the most from him. He had problems with alcohol and drugs at various points. He traveled widely and frequently. His itinerant work gave him large windows of unsupervised time across 3 decades. Investigators cross-referenced his DNA against unsolved case databases in Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. At the time of the October 2020 announcement, no additional matches had been returned. The question of whether Christine Jessop was his only victim remained formally open. In 2015, Calvin Hoover died by carbon monoxide poisoning at his home in Port Hope, Ontario. He was 59 years old. An autopsy was conducted. A blood sample was collected and preserved at the Centre of Forensic Sciences Laboratory in Toronto. He died having never been questioned about Christine Jessop, never charged, never required to account in any setting for where he was on the afternoon of October 3, 1984. He carried what he had done in private and alone until the end. Heather Hoover had kept Christine's last school photograph for years. It hung on a wall in her home, Christine in a white blouse, smiling at the camera. When police called Heather in October 2020 to confirm what the DNA had established, she said, "That type of DNA does not lie. There is only one way it got there." She said she has not slept well since that call. On October 15, 2020, Toronto Police Acting Chief James Raymer stood before cameras at police headquarters alongside Staff Superintendent Peter Code from Detective Operations. The press conference was measured and direct. Raymer confirmed that on October 9, police had positively identified the person responsible for the evidence found in Christine Jessop's case. He was named Calvin Hoover, 28 years old at the time, a family acquaintance of the Jessops. He confirmed Hoover had died in 2015. He confirmed there would be no criminal prosecution. He said, if he were alive today, the Toronto Police Service would arrest Calvin Hoover for the death of Christine Jessop. Staff Superintendent Peter Code explained the genealogy process in plain language. The work starts with an unidentified DNA profile submitted to a laboratory. From that profile, a potential familial lineage is constructed. From that lineage, investigators work downward toward potential persons of interest. Hoover's name had emerged from two separate family branches in the genealogical search, two independent genetic lines pointing to the same individual. That convergence, combined with his documented connection to the Jessop family, made him the candidate. The confirmation from his autopsy sample made him the answer. Before the press conference, Toronto police personally contacted Justice Fred Kaufman, the man who had led the public inquiry into Guy Paul Morin's wrongful conviction, to inform him directly. Given the scope of what the Kaufman Commission had contributed to this case, he deserved to hear the news before it became public. Guy Paul Morin issued a statement through his lawyer that same day. He said he was relieved for Christine's family. He said that when the DNA cleared him in 1995, he had been certain one day the same science would identify the real person responsible. He said it now had. His statement was calm, measured, entirely consistent with everything he had ever said publicly about this case across 3.5 decades. The justice system had failed him. Science had saved him. In October 2020, he watched science complete what it had started. And if this documentary has given you something, subscribe to Unveiled Cold Case Files right now. Hit the notification bell. The final chapter belongs entirely to the families, the Jessops, the Morins, Heather Hoover, and the question of what Christine Jessop's case means for the country that failed to find the answer for 36 years. That chapter is next. On the morning of October 15, 2020, before any press conference was held or public announcement made, 2 Toronto police officers drove to a home in the Barrie area of Ontario and knocked on the door of the man who had spent 10 years under prosecution for Christine Jessop's death, 18 months in a prison cell for something he had not done, and 25 years quietly rebuilding his life after his exoneration. Guy Paul Morin answered the door. The officers told him what the DNA had confirmed. A family friend of the Jessops, a man who had participated in the search for Christine, attended her funeral, and stood at her graveside consoling her mother for years, was the person responsible for Christine's death. Morin was not a suspect. He had never been a suspect. The justice system had simply reached a different conclusion for a decade. Morin did not make a long statement. He never had. He said he was relieved for Christine's mother Janet and her family and hoped this would give them some peace. He said that when the DNA cleared him in 1995, he had been certain the same science would one day name the real person responsible. He said it now had. His statement was calm and measured in exactly the way every public word he had spoken about this case had been for 35 years. That same morning, Toronto police investigators met with the Jessop family before the afternoon press conference brought the information to the country. They told Janet, Kenny, and Bob about Calvin Hoover. They told them about the DNA match. They told them that the man who had worked alongside Bob at Eastern Independent Telecom, whose wife Janet had called the Goofy Newfie, whose children Christine and Kenny had played with, that man was the one who had taken Christine from that house on October 3, 1984. Kenny Jessop described the reaction as stunned. Happily stunned, he said, because they finally had a name. He had believed from the very first days after Christine disappeared that the person responsible would turn out to be someone the family knew. Someone who knew their father was in custody. Someone who knew Christine would be alone. He had said that from day one. 36 years later, he had been right. But being right brings no peace by itself. Kenny's first public statement went beyond relief. He said the last 36 years had been a nightmare of trials, appeals, and events that had almost destroyed both his mother and himself. He said their prayers were answered on October 15, 2020. And then he said this: the answer was not justice. It was a kick in the teeth. Calvin Hoover had died in 2015. There would be no trial, no courtroom, no formal verdict delivered before witnesses, no sentencing. The identification was scientifically definitive. The confirmation was beyond question. The accountability was permanently beyond reach. What Kenny said about his mother in those first public statements is the detail from this chapter that stays with people who follow this case. He said that for the first time in 36 years, his mother would not go to bed each night praying to find out who had killed his sister. He said it was a miracle. He said he could find no other word for it. Think about what that holds. Every night for 36 years, Janet Jessop had closed her eyes without knowing. Every morning she had opened them to the same unresolved question at the center of everything. She had watched a neighbor be arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. She had watched that conviction collapse. She had watched investigators pursue 300 alternative names and return empty. She had grown older inside a question with no end. And every night, the same prayer. Now she knew. Janet, when asked what she wanted people to understand about Christine, said simply that her daughter should have had a chance to live. The whole weight of 36 years compressed into one plain statement. She should have had that chance. Bob Jessop spoke to the CBC Fifth Estate about learning of Hoover's involvement. He said he did not remember much about Calvin Hoover. He said the news was difficult to fully absorb. He said he could not work out what the reason would have been. And in an interview with the Toronto Sun, Bob Jessop made clear in direct and unsparing terms exactly what he wished he could have done to the man who had taken his daughter from the world. He meant it the way parents mean things when ordinary language fails under the weight of what they are carrying. Kenny said he was glad Guy Paul Morin was finally free of the whispers and residual suspicion that had followed him even 25 years after the exoneration. The identification of Calvin Hoover erased that residual doubt entirely. There was now a name. There was confirmed DNA. There was no ambiguity left for anyone willing to look at the evidence honestly. Kenny and Janet told reporters they had become each other's pillars of strength across the full length of this ordeal. They had held each other up through the original grief, the wrongful prosecution, the exoneration, the task force, the long silence, and now this. They were closer than they had ever been. Still, as Kenny put it, a big brother and his little sister, finding ways to carry what Christine's loss had left them with. On October 28, 2020, 13 days after the press conference, Janet and Kenny Jessop joined Innocence Canada in formally demanding an independent review of how two police services had failed for 3 decades to identify a man whose name had appeared in the original case files as a family friend. Kenny's statement to Innocence Canada was direct. Investigators had supposedly looked at everybody and all their movements. Hoover's wife had been specifically noted in the original missing persons documentation as someone who had been aware Christine would be home alone that afternoon. He asked, without excess language, how they had missed this. That question has not been answered to the family's satisfaction. Folklore Chevrier, the Toronto producer who had spent more than a decade with exclusive rights to the Jessop family story, was developing a docuseries called Darkness in Daylight at the time of the announcement. She described the family's state in the days after October 15 in terms that went beyond any press statement. She said they were filled with guilt, with anger, with hurt, with disbelief. More questions in those days than in the previous 36 years combined. How could someone so close to them have done this? How could the man who had helped search for Christine, who had been at her funeral, who had stood at her graveside, how could that have been the person? How had no one seen it? Those questions, she said, do not disappear when a case is resolved. For the Jessop family, this was never going to be about a clean end. It was about moving forward, and for the very first time, telling their own truth. East Gwillimbury Mayor Virginia Haxon noted that many of the people who had lived in Queensville in 1984 still lived there. This was a community where people stayed. The case had been part of that community's identity for 36 years, present in every anniversary, every returned conversation, every moment that circled back to October 1984. Now it had a name attached to it. Clayton Ruby, who had defended Morin through the first trial in 1986 and watched from outside as the proceedings continued and eventually collapsed, said publicly that the identification of Calvin Hoover answered the one question the 1995 DNA exoneration had been unable to answer. In 1995, the science had said, not Morin. In 2020, the science said, Hoover. Anyone still holding onto residual doubt about Morin's innocence, Ruby said, now had nowhere left to stand. The investigation into Calvin Hoover's full history remained active. Toronto police had spoken to almost 100 people who knew him. His DNA had been checked against unsolved case databases in Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. At the time of the October 2020 announcement, no additional matches had been returned. The question of whether Christine was his only victim remained formally open. The case is closed in the formal legal record. Calvin Hoover has been identified as the person responsible for Christine Jessop's death. He cannot be prosecuted. He cannot be sentenced. He is gone. The record of what he did exists in the DNA match, in the official announcement of October 15, 2020, in every report that named him, and in the permanent history of a case that changed how Canada investigates serious crime. What the record does not answer, what nothing can answer, is why. Why Christine? Why that afternoon? Why a 9-year-old girl with a recorder in her bag and bubble gum in her pocket and a friend waiting at a park? Why the searches, the funeral, the years at the graveside, the certainty that he would never be found? Those questions belong to a man who is no longer here to be asked. They remain open, the way some things always do when the person holding the answer is gone. What is not open is Christine Jessop's place in the history of Canadian justice. Her case, and everything that followed across 36 years, changed how this country approaches serious crime investigations. It produced the Kaufman Commission and its 119 recommendations. It produced the National DNA Databank established in 2001. It produced Innocence Canada, which has since secured the exoneration of more than 20 wrongfully convicted Canadians. It contributed to the significant reduction of informant witness practices that had helped imprison an innocent man. It is taught in law schools. It is cited in judicial decisions. It is referenced whenever the conversation turns to how a justice system fails and what is required to make sure that failure cannot repeat. Kenny Jessop said the identification was not justice. It was a kick in the teeth. Calvin Hoover died in 2015 without ever being questioned, charged, or required to account in any formal setting for what he did on October 3, 1984. Here is the final question of this documentary. When a person responsible for a crime dies before the science reaches them, when confirmation comes too late for any court to act, does that constitute justice? Or is it something else entirely? A different word for a different kind of outcome? Tell us what you think in the comments. This conversation belongs to everyone who has followed Christine's story. If this documentary gave you something, if it added depth to a case you thought you knew, or introduced you to a story you had never fully encountered before, subscribe and share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear Christine Jessop's name. Every share keeps her story present in the world where it belongs. This channel exists to cover real cases with the depth and accuracy they deserve. Every name, every fact, every person treated as someone who matters. We do not summarize. We do not skip what is difficult or complicated. We stay until the end. Because Christine Jessop stayed until the end, every person at the center of these cases did. The least we can do is stay with them. Christine Marion Jessop, November 29, 1974 to October 3, 1984. She deserved more time.